The sun was a white-hot coin in the Kansas sky. It hung low over the dusty horizon of Abilene. The year was 1875. The air felt heavy and still. Caleb Thorne wiped the sweat from his brow. He was the most reliable blacksmith in the county. Men traveled 40 miles for his ironwork. He knew the rhythm of the hammer. But to young Toby, he was not a craftsman. He was simply Pa. Caleb adjusted his heavy leather apron. He looked down at his 7-year-old son. Every decision Caleb made began and ended with one question. Would this give Toby a better life? The boy was sitting in the dirt near the anvil. He was playing with a wooden horse. Caleb had carved it from a block of scrap oak. It was a rough toy, but to Toby it was a prize. Toby's face was smeared with soot and grime. A streak of black grease marked his forehead. The boy's soft laughter echoed in the shop. It was the only thing that Caleb's heart beating. Life on the frontier was a jagged road. It was never easy for a man alone. Caleb was a widower. He had lost his wife, Sarah, 3 years ago. The great fever had taken her in the night. She had slipped away like a candle flame in a draft. Since then, the house had been too quiet. The kitchen felt cold even with a roaring fire. He had been both father and mother to the boy. He didn't mind the aching muscles. He didn't mind the lonely nights by the fire. He only cared about the boy's future. He wanted Toby to have more than a hammer and an anvil. He wanted him to read leather-bound books. He wanted him to see the world beyond the plains. Across the street, a magnificent stagecoach appeared. It rolled into the station with a thunderous rattle. The coach was painted a deep, regal crimson.
It had polished gold trimmings that caught the light. Such a sight was rare in a dusty cattle town. Dust rose beneath the hooves of the 4-horse team. It swirled around the heavy, grease-slicked wheels. The driver pulled back on the leather reins. The horses snorted and stamped their hooves. The door creaked open with a groan of fine hinges. A woman stepped down onto the wooden platform. She was dressed in a gown of fine blue silk. The fabric shimmered like a mountain lake. Her hair was dark and tucked neatly away. It sat under a fashionable, wide-brimmed bonnet. This was Eliza Montgomery. She was a woman of obvious wealth. She was one of the wealthiest widows ever to settle near Abilene. She carried herself with a quiet, stiff dignity. Her late husband had been a highly successful merchant in St. Louis, but the panic of 1873 had changed many lives. Fortunes were lost in the blink of an eye. People in St. Louis talked behind silk fans. They judged her for her grief. They judged her for her independence. In Kansas, the wind didn't gossip. In Kansas, people spoke to your face. Beside her stepped a young girl. She was about Toby's age. Her name was May. May wore a pink dress with white lace. It looked far too clean for the plains of Abilene. She looked around the town with wide eyes. She didn't see the piles of dung. She didn't see the rough, unshaven men. She saw a world of endless adventure. She saw a sky that never ended. Eliza sighed and clutched a lace handkerchief. She dabbed at the moisture on her neck. The heat was a physical weight. It was unlike the humid warmth of Missouri.
This heat was dry and sharp. It tasted of copper and grit. She looked toward the open doors of the blacksmith shop. There stood Caleb Thorne. He was tall and formidable. His chest was broad as a barn door. His arms were like trunks of weathered cedar. He was a man who looked carved from the land itself. Their eyes met across the dusty road. The air between them seemed to hum. The noise of the town faded for a moment. The lowing of the cattle became a distant murmur. Caleb tipped his worn, sweat-stained hat. It was a gesture of simple, honest respect. Eliza gave a small, polite nod. She felt a strange flutter in her chest. It was a feeling she thought had died with her husband. She didn't know then that her world was shifting. Her life was about to change forever. May, however, was already moving. The girl didn't care about propriety. She walked toward the shop. Her eyes were fixed on the boy in the dirt. Toby looked up from his wooden horse. The two children stared at each other. One was covered in the soot of honest labor. The other was wrapped in the silk of a lost world. Neither child smiled, but neither one looked away. Sometimes children recognize loneliness before adults ever do. "Is that your horse?" May asked. She pointed a small finger at the toy. Toby nodded shyly. He tucked his chin toward his chest. "My pa made it," he whispered. May looked up at Caleb. She saw the soot on his skin. She saw the kindness in his tired eyes. She saw the way he looked at his son. It was a look of pure, unyielding pride.
It was a look she missed from her own father. May turned back to her mother. Then she looked back at the tall blacksmith. She took a deep breath. "My mom needs a husband," she said clearly. The words rang out in the quiet afternoon. The entire street seemed to fall silent. Even the horses stopped shifting for a heartbeat. Caleb froze in place. His heavy hammer stayed midair. The red-hot iron on the anvil began to dim. Eliza's face turned a bright shade of scarlet. The color rushed from her neck to her brow. She rushed over to her daughter. Her heeled boots clicked sharply against the wooden platform. "May, we do not speak to strangers like that," Eliza whispered. Her voice was tight with embarrassment. The girl didn't back down. She looked at the dusty ground. "But Mom, you cry at night," May said. "You think I'm asleep, but I hear you. And Mr. Blacksmith looks like he can fix anything." Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. The hammer felt heavy in his hand. He looked at Eliza. She was mortified. She looked like she wanted the earth to open up. She wanted the Kansas dust to swallow her whole. "I am so sorry, sir," Eliza stammered. She gripped her parasol tightly. She has a very active imagination." Caleb set his hammer down on the anvil. The ringing sound faded into the wind. He didn't laugh at her. He didn't make a cruel joke. He saw the pain behind her polished exterior. He saw the same loneliness he felt. It was a heavy, hollow thing in the chest. "It's all right, ma'am," Caleb said softly. His voice was like low thunder. "Children have a way of seeing things. They see the truth we try to hide." Eliza looked at him. She truly looked at him for the first time. She saw the depth in his steady gaze. She saw a man who had known deep loss. She saw a man who understood silence. In that moment, a bond was formed. It wasn't love. It was simple, raw recognition. Two broken souls stood in the Kansas heat. Abilene was changing. The great cattle years were fading, and railroads, fences, and new families were reshaping the Kansas plains. For Caleb and Eliza, it would become something even more important. It would become a place of healing. Eliza had purchased a ranch. It sat on the green outskirts of town. It was a beautiful property with a winding creek. The house was large and grand, but the fences were rotting. The barn doors were hanging by rusted hinges. The wind whistled through the gaps in the walls. She had the money to hire a dozen men, but she didn't know who to trust. The West was full of wolves. Many men wanted a rich widow's gold. They wore smiles but had cold hearts. Caleb, however, never asked for a penny. Several weeks passed. By then, Caleb's quiet visits had become something both children expected. Caleb showed up at her front gate. The sun was just beginning to climb. He had a heavy wooden toolbox in his hand. Toby was by his side. "The fence near your creek is down," Caleb said. He didn't wait for a greeting. "If you don't fix it, the cattle will wander."
"They'll get lost in the North Ravine." Eliza stood on her porch. She held a cup of tea in trembling hands. "I haven't hired anyone yet," she replied. She looked at his toolkit. "I'm not asking for a job," Caleb said simply. He set the box on the grass. "I'm just being a neighbor." He spent the entire afternoon working. The sun was a blistering eye in the sky. He repaired the fence with practiced ease. He swung the mallet with rhythmic grace. The sound of cedar posts being driven into the earth was constant. It was a solid, reassuring sound. Toby and May played in the tall grass. They chased grasshoppers. They laughed until their sides ached. The differences in their clothes didn't matter. They were just two children in the sun. Eliza watched them from the shade of the porch. She felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She brought out a pitcher of cold lemonade. The ice clinked against the glass. She watched Caleb work. His muscles rippled under his damp shirt. He was a man of action. He didn't offer empty promises or flowery words. He didn't talk much at all. He believed that a man's worth was in his hands. When the sun began to dip, he finished. He didn't linger for praise. He gathered his tools with a steady hand. He just tipped his hat. He started to walk back toward town. "Wait!" Eliza called out. She stepped off the porch. "Let me pay you for your time."
Caleb stopped in the dirt road. He turned around slowly. "Neighbors don't pay neighbors for sweat," he said.
His face was etched with exhaustion. "But if you want to say thanks, bake a pie. Send it over to the forge sometime." He gave a small, rare smile. He continued on his way. Eliza felt a warmth in her heart. It was better than the summer sun. She spent that evening in the kitchen. The wood stove made the room stifling. She hadn't baked a pie in a decade. In St. Louis, the servants did the cooking. Her hands were used to fine embroidery. They were not used to flour and lard. But she tried her best. She rolled the dough with a heavy pin. She made a cherry pie. The fruit came from the trees by the creek. The crust was a bit uneven. The edges were slightly burnt and dark. But she delivered it the next day. She brought it to the forge herself. The smell of the shop was intense. It was a mix of coal smoke and hot metal. Caleb ate every single bite. He told her it was the best pie in Kansas. Eliza knew he was lying. She saw the charred bits on the crust. She saw him swallow a particularly tough piece, but she didn't mind one bit. She laughed for the first time in years. As the weeks passed, the visits grew. Caleb would stop by to check the horses. He would fix a latch or oil a hinge. He would check the roof for leaks. Eliza would bring the children to the forge. They would watch the sparks fly in the dark. The sparks were like tiny stars. The townspeople began to whisper. Gossip is the fire of small towns.
It spreads faster than a prairie blaze. They wondered about the widow and the smith. They wondered if he was a fortune hunter. They wondered if she was a desperate woman. But those who knew Caleb knew his soul. He was a man of absolute integrity. He valued a person's heart over their gold. However, trouble was brewing in Abilene. A man named Silas Thorne lived in town. He was a wealthy land speculator. He had no relation to Caleb. He was a man of cold eyes and expensive suits. He carried a silver-topped cane. Silas wanted Eliza's land. He had learned that a new freight spur was being surveyed outside Abilene. One proposed route crossed the edge of Eliza's valley. If the survey was approved, her land could soon be worth 10 times its present value. He offered her a price. It was an insult to her husband's memory. It was a pittance for such a beautiful ranch. When she refused, his smile vanished. His eyes turned as cold as a Kansas winter. He turned to darker, quiet methods. He began to sabotage her ranch. One night, her irrigation gate was smashed. The water flooded the lower pasture. The next week, a well was fouled with oil. The water was black and toxic. Eliza was frightened. She was a woman alone in a hard land. She didn't tell Caleb at first. She didn't want to be a burden. She didn't want him to fight her battles. She was used to solving her own problems. But Caleb noticed the shadows in her eyes. He saw the way her hands shook when she held a cup. He saw the dark circles under her lashes. One evening, he found her on the porch. The sun had already set. She was sitting on the steps, weeping.
Her head was in her hands. The weight of the world had broken her. Caleb sat down beside her. The wood groaned under his weight. He didn't speak. He didn't ask her to stop crying. He just let her lean her head on his shoulder. She smelled of lavender and grief. He smelled of iron and hard work. She told him everything. She told of the threats Silas had made. She told him of the poisoned water. Caleb's jaw tightened until it ached. His hands clenched into stone-hard fists. "I won't let him hurt you," Caleb promised. His voice was a low growl. "He thinks you are weak because you are kind. He thinks a woman cannot stand her ground. He is about to learn a very hard lesson." The next day, Caleb did something bold. He didn't go to the local sheriff. The sheriff was often seen drinking with Silas. The law was sometimes a matter of coin. Caleb didn't go to the bank. He walked straight into the Red Dog Saloon. The air inside was thick with cigar smoke. It was where the speculator spent his afternoons. Caleb didn't pull a pistol. He didn't raise his voice in anger. He simply walked to Silas's table. He placed a heavy iron bar on the wood. The bar was thick and black. It made a heavy thud on the tabletop. "This bar was forged from my strongest steel," Caleb said. The saloon went deathly quiet. The piano player stopped mid-song. The gamblers looked up from their cards.
If any more harm comes to that ranch, I will bring every piece of evidence I find before this entire town, and I will not stop until the man responsible answers for it." Silas Thorne laughed nervously.
He looked at his hired guards. He looked at his gold watch. "You're just a blacksmith," Silas sneered. "You have no power in this town." "And you're just a man in a fancy suit," Caleb replied. "The suit won't stop the truth. The suit won't stop the steal." Caleb walked out. He didn't look back. He left the iron bar on the table. It was a declaration of war. It was a declaration of something more. The town was buzzing like a hive of bees. Everyone waited for the next move. Would Silas back down, or would the streets of Abilene run red? The tension was thick enough to choke on. Silas felt humiliated. He was a man of pride and ego. He decided to strike back with a snake's tongue. He didn't attack Caleb physically. He knew the blacksmith was too strong. He knew Caleb could crush a man's ribs with one hand. Instead, he attacked Eliza's name. He started rumors in the general store. He whispered at the livery stable. He claimed she was a woman of low morals. He said she was paying Caleb with more than pie. He said she was a widow who forgot her husband too soon. In 1875, a woman's reputation was her life. If she was disgraced, she was finished. The local ladies' guild began to turn away. They pulled their skirts aside when she passed. They whispered behind their hands in church. Shopkeepers became cold and short. They didn't offer her a chair anymore. Eliza felt the sting of every cold shoulder. She felt the weight of the town's judgment. She thought about packing her trunks. She thought about the train back to St. Louis. She thought about the comfort of the city. She thought about giving up her dream. But then she looked at May. The girl was brown from the sun. She was healthy and vibrant. She was finally happy. She had a brother in Toby. They were inseparable now. Eliza couldn't steal that happiness away. She decided to stay and fight. One night, a scream woke the birds. A fire had broke Eliza's barn. The flames licked at the dark sky. They looked like orange claws. The dry hay went up in an instant. The sound of the fire was a hungry roar. The horses inside screamed in terror. The sound was haunting. It was a sound of pure panic. Eliza ran out into the yard. She was clutching her white nightgown. She tried to pull the heavy barn doors, but the heat was a wall of fire. It singed her hair and her eyelashes. Suddenly, a shadow raced across the yard. It was Caleb. He had seen the glow from his shop. He threw himself onto his old bay horse. The exhausted animal raced across the dark prairie as if it understood every second mattered. He didn't hesitate for a second. He soaked his coat in a water trough. The water was cold and dirty. He threw the heavy, wet wool over his head. He charged into the inferno. "Caleb, no," Eliza screamed. She fell to her knees in the dirt. She prayed to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. The minutes felt like hours. The roof of the barn began to groan. The timber cracked like pistol shots. The heat was melting the very hinges. Just as the front beam collapsed, he appeared. Caleb emerged from the black smoke. He was a ghost of soot and fire. He was leading the two trapped horses. Their eyes were wide with panic. Their coats were damp with sweat. Caleb's clothes were scorched and black. The skin across his left forearm had blistered badly. Every movement sent pain through his body. He collapsed onto the grass. He fought for every breath of air. Eliza ran to him. She didn't care about the heat. She didn't care about the soot. She held him in her arms and wept. She kissed his scorched forehead. "You're a fool," she sobbed. "You could have died for a few animals." Caleb coughed and looked up. A weak smile touched his soot-stained lips. "The horses, they are safe," he whispered. "Everything else can be rebuilt." In that moment, the rumors died. The social status didn't matter. The money was irrelevant. Only the man in her arms mattered. They began to see how cruel and baseless the gossip had been. Whatever Caleb felt for Eliza, it had never been about her fortune. But Silas Thorne wasn't finished yet. He was a man who hated to lose. He had one last card to play. He produced a document with a legal seal. It looked official and old. He claimed it was a debt note. He said Eliza's husband had owed him thousands. He said the ranch was the collateral. He demanded the ranch as payment for the debt. The local judge was a friend of Silas. He was a man who could be bought. He was a man of greed and small vision. A hearing was set for the following week. Eliza was devastated. She looked through her own papers. She knew the document was a forgery. Her husband never did business with men like Silas. But she couldn't prove it. She didn't have the papers from St. Louis. The mail was slow and unreliable. She didn't have a lawyer she could trust. She felt the walls closing in. Caleb watched her fall into despair. He saw her sitting in the dark house. He knew he had to do something drastic. He knew he had to make a sacrifice. Caleb had been saving money for 7 years. Every penny from the forge was saved. He didn't spend on himself. He didn't buy new clothes or fine tobacco. He kept it in an iron box under the floor. That money was for Toby's education. It was Toby's ticket to a better life. It was the most precious thing Caleb owned. It was the boy's entire future. But Caleb knew he could not turn away. He looked at his son sleeping in his cot. Caleb opened the iron box. His rough fingers rested on the small stack of carefully folded bills. He closed the lid. Then he opened it again. Toby stirred beneath the quilt and opened his eyes. "If it helps Miss Eliza and May stay," the boy whispered. "Then use it, Pa." Caleb swallowed hard. "I will earn every penny back," he promised. Toby reached for his father's rough hand. "I know you will." Caleb took the iron box and rode for Topeka.
He pushed his old bay horse hard, stopping only when the animal needed water and rest. In Topeka, he found an old Union Army friend who now worked among the state archives and legal records. Without that man's help, the search might have taken months. He spent days in the dusty archives. The libraries were filled with old ledgers. He searched through old shipping records. He searched for Silas Thorne's real history. He hired a respected lawyer from Topeka. The man had a reputation for defending the truth, even when powerful men tried to buy his silence. Caleb spent every last cent of the savings. The box was empty for the first time in years. He bought the truth with Toby's school money. He found proof that Silas was a fraud. He found evidence of past crimes in Missouri. Silas had a different name back then. Caleb returned to Abilene just in time. The sun was high, and the courthouse was hot. The hearing was starting in the small courthouse. The room was packed with curious neighbors. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and wool. Silas sat at the front. He looked smug and victorious. He wore a new suit for the occasion. Eliza sat at the defense table. Her head was bowed in defeat. She looked small and fragile. The judge was about to sign the order. He dipped his pen in the inkwell. Suddenly, the heavy doors swung open. The sound echoed off the high ceiling. Caleb walked down the center aisle. His boots thudded on the wooden floor. He wasn't wearing his leather apron. He was wearing a suit. It was tight across his massive shoulders. It was a bit short in the sleeves, but he looked like a king. He handed a stack of papers to the lawyer. The city lawyer stood up. He adjusted his spectacles.
His voice was loud and commanding. It cut through the room like a bell. "Your Honor, we have new evidence," he said. "This claim is a complete fabrication. The man sitting there is not Silas Thorne. He is a convicted swindler named Henry Vance." For the next hour, the truth came out. The lawyer showed the forged signatures. He showed the real records from St. Louis. He revealed the dark past of the speculator. The room began to murmur. The judge looked at the papers. His face turned pale. He knew he couldn't hide the truth now. Silas suddenly lunged toward the door, but a state marshal who had accompanied the lawyer from Topeka stepped into his path. The marshal caught Silas by the arm and placed him under arrest. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Men threw their hats into the air. The ladies of the guild began to clap. Eliza stood up. Tears of joy streamed down her face. She looked at Caleb. He was standing at the back of the room. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had walked 1,000 miles. His suit was dusty from the road, but his eyes were peaceful. They were filled with a quiet light. After the hearing, Eliza found him outside. The sun was setting behind the hills. The sky was a canvas of purple and gold. Silence filled the evening. Even the wind seemed unwilling to interrupt him. "You did this," she said. Her voice was trembling with emotion. "How did you pay for a man from Topeka? How did you find those papers?"
Caleb looked down at his scuffed boots.
He didn't want to tell her. "It doesn't matter now," he said quietly. "The ranch is yours." "But it does," Eliza insisted. "That cost more than a blacksmith makes in a year. You gave away your son's future." Tears rolled freely down Eliza's face. She no longer tried to hide them. Caleb finally met her gaze. He saw the love in her eyes. "I used Toby's school money," he admitted. "It was the only way to get a man who wouldn't blink." Several townspeople were still leaving the courthouse. They stopped when they heard his confession. A stunned silence spread across the steps. No one had imagined the quiet blacksmith had paid such a personal price to save her home. Eliza gasped and covered her mouth. She knew what that box meant to him. She knew the weight of that sacrifice. She knew he had given up his son's dream for her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you give that up for me?" Caleb took her hand. His skin was rough and scarred from the fire. His hands were steady. "A boy's education is a fine thing," Caleb said, "but a boy needs a mother more than a book. And I need you more than the air. I need you to be the heart of this home." Eliza pulled him into a fierce hug. She cried into his chest. They were happy tears. "I'll pay it back," she promised. "Toby will go to the best school in the world. He will be a doctor or a lawyer." Caleb held her tight against the wind. "We'll do it together," he said. "We'll build a future for both of them." The shocking act wasn't the fight.
It wasn't the fire or the iron bar. It was the quiet gift of a father's dream. He had given it away for the woman he loved. He had chosen her over his own pride. The season slowly turned. By the spring of 1876, the wildflowers covered the prairie like a quilt. The world was green and full of life. The church bells of Abilene rang out. The sound carried for miles. It was a joyful sound. Caleb and Eliza stood at the altar. The church was filled with flowers. Caleb looked handsome in his dark suit. He had trimmed his beard. Eliza was radiant in a simple white dress. It wasn't the silk of St. Louis. It was better. Toby and May stood beside them. Without anyone asking, the two children quietly reached for each other's hands. Neither of them ever let go during the ceremony. Toby was dressed like a little gentleman. He held the rings with great care. May was beaming. She held a bouquet of yellow daisies. The preacher spoke of honor. He spoke of the strength of the spirit. He spoke of the bond that forged two families into one. When he called them husband and wife, the town roared. Even the Ladies' Guild was there. They brought quilts and well wishes. They brought their best cakes. The reception was held at the ranch. The barn had been rebuilt. It smelled of fresh cedar and pine. There was music from a lively fiddle. There was dancing under the vast Kansas stars. Caleb and Eliza shared their first dance. The blacksmith and the widow were gone. They were simply two people who were home.
They moved with a slow, easy grace. As the music slowed, May walked up to them. She looked at her new father. She looked at her happy mother. "See," she said with a mischievous grin. "I told you he could fix anything." Caleb laughed. The sound was rich and full. He picked the girl up and swung her around. "You were right, May," Caleb said. "You were absolutely right." Life on the frontier remained a challenge. The winters were cold and bitter. The snow would pile up against the doors. The summers were dry and dusty. There were many more trials to come. There were droughts and storms, but Caleb and Eliza faced them as one. They built a life on respect and sacrifice. They raised Toby and May to be strong. They taught them the value of the truth. The ranch prospered beyond anyone's expectations, allowing Eliza to repay every dollar Caleb had sacrificed for Toby's future. Toby did eventually go to a great school. Eliza made sure of that. He became a doctor in the territory. He carried a black bag and a kind heart. He saved many lives on the plains. May grew up to be a teacher. She built a schoolhouse on the hill. She shared the love of stories with children. And Eliza. She never felt like a rich widow again. She felt like a woman who was truly seen. She spent her days tending the land. She planted a garden that bloomed every spring. She spent her evenings by the fire with Caleb. They would sit on the porch. They would watch the sun dip below the grass. They would hold hands in the twilight. They would remember the day the stagecoach arrived. They would thank God for a little girl's request. Some stories are remembered because of great battles.
Others are remembered because one ordinary person quietly chose love over fear. Caleb never became the richest man in Kansas. Eliza never became the most famous widow in the West. But together they built something far more valuable: a family. And sometimes that is the greatest victory a person can ever earn.
If Caleb and Eliza's journey touched your heart today, leave a nice below. Your support helps our channel grow.
It allows us to tell more tales of the West. Before you go, please subscribe. Turn on the notification bell. We have an incredible story coming next. It is about a traveler in a mountain town. He carries a locked trunk and a dark secret. The secret will change a whole town forever. You won't want to miss a single word. Until next time, cherish your loved ones. Remember that love is the greatest frontier. Goodbye for now. We will see you in the next video.